If we are scrolling, right? So bringing up the scrolling side, oh God, that is a dopamine hit like nobody's business, right? And it doesn't even have to be anything big, but literally just the action of movement focus, movement refocus. You're asking your body to hyper produce the dopamine. And if we do that, we start to exhaust that already exhausted system.
Welcome to the Birth Lounge Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts, support your mental health, and learn the tips and tricks that thousands of parents have used to craft their ideal birth. We will answer all of your questions, the scary ones and the weird ones, to help calm your fears and feel confident going into your birth. I'm going to help you redefine what birth and motherhood looks like and how to embrace your journey. I've intentionally crafted a list of experts to help you navigate pregnancy, explore your birth options, and plan for postpartum so that it can be a time of soaking in your tiny human. We're going to go there on all the hard topics so that you can dive deep into finding your confidence and freeing yourself from fears around birth. With over 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I created this podcast as a way to share the resources parents need to make educated and informed decisions about their care in pregnancy and childbirth. This is a birth community driven by evidence-based information and research in hopes to help you explore your options, understand your rights, and know what choices you have along the way when it comes to birth and beyond. I'm your host, Hehe. Now let's get to the good stuff. Hello, have you heard about my completely free class that teaches you 6 evidence-based ways to avoid a C-section and reduce your tearing in labor by up to 50%? And remember, I mentioned it was completely free. This class is going to teach you how to advocate for your preferences in the birth room so that you can have a birth that's filled with joy and not birth trauma. Advocating for yourself starts with being empowered with the right information so that you can ask the right questions and confidently make decisions during labor based on what feels good to you and your baby. But here's the thing. The U.S. has one of the highest C-section rates in the world, and it is ever climbing year after year. And it's not because the system is broken, albeit it is, but it's really because women don't have the tools to navigate that broken system. We may not be able to change the system before you have your baby, but what we can do is change how you operate within that system. Change the conversations that you're having with your providers. Change the places that you are getting your information to help you have informed conversation with your doctor before you have your baby. I want to teach you how to do that. We know the reasons that our C-section rates are climbing. We know the reasons that inductions happen so often, and we know the reasons that babies end up in the NICU. I want to help you avoid all of that so that you can have a birth that you love. You can find my free class at thebirthlounge.com/C-section so that you can learn 6 evidence-based ways to avoid a C-section and reduce your tearing in labor. Again, that is thebirthlounge.com/C-section. See you there. Bye. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Birth Lounge podcast. All right, you guys, I feel like in pregnancy, there's this overwhelming list of to-dos, things to buy, supplements to take. You must do this. You can't do that. However, some of them are really important. Not all of them. Some of them are total waste of time and waste of money. But one of them that is actually super important and not only will impact your pregnancy, but actually has impacts on the outcomes for you and your baby is vitamin D. Now, if you know anything about vitamin D, you probably know that we supplement babies when they are little because most humans, especially in the US, are deficient in vitamin D. And you are no different. You and I are walking around probably chronically low in vitamin D. Now, for a lot of us, we're probably thinking, so what? What's it matter if we're chronically low? Why does it matter? Well, in pregnancy, being low in vitamin D actually has some pretty big impacts. If you don't have enough vitamin D, you may find that it impacts preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, regulation of calcium. So today I'm so excited to have on Sarah Thompson. She's a functional medicine practitioner, and you actually may recognize her from her Instagram Functional Maternity or one of her 2 books, Functional Maternity, a book for mamas, or Beyond Result, a book for practitioners. Sarah's private practice combines functional medicine, nutrition, and traditional Chinese medicine to actually support you as a whole being through your conception journey, pregnancy, and postpartum. She is a MEAC accredited educator, and she provides continuing education courses in the field of nutrition and functional medicine for midwives. In today's episode, we are going to talk about signs and symptoms of vitamin D deficiency. How do you know if you are getting too much? What do we need to know about vitamin D supplements for you and your baby? What's the resolution for poor conversion of vitamin D, and what would cause that? We're also going to be talking about iron absorption, insulin production, white blood cell formation, and what vitamin D has to do with that. And we're diving into PCOS and whether red light therapy is actually good for you. One thing that I love so much about her is her dedication to advancing the understanding of nutrition and functional medicine in pregnancy. And for me, that expands the access that women have to healthcare practitioners to truly get them individualized care that much more. Sarah is passionate about empowering both practitioners and patients through education, and I know you guys are going to love her as much as I do. I've learned so much from her on her Instagram account, and so it is beyond an honor to have her on the show with us today. Without further ado, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on today.
Of course. I know I mentioned in the intro how excited I am to have you on because you're someone I've learned so much from online, on Instagram. I have followed you for a long time. And more importantly, I'm really excited to talk about something that I think doesn't get enough light in pregnancy. Not a lot of people are having these conversations about specific minerals and vitamins and what their role is and why they're so beneficial and how we can get them and what our deficiency might look like. How do we test for that? There's so many questions. But before we do that, could you break down maybe 101? What is vitamin D? Where do we get it? And why is it important for humans to have?
So vitamin D is a very complicated vitamin because what we get in the diet isn't necessarily what we're thinking from that functional perspective. It's not what actually works in the body. It's like a precursor to what works in the body. So vitamin D we get in basically 2 forms. One is UV conversion from a specific type of cholesterol in our skin to what we then consume in the diet. So most people think of like vitamin D3, right? Cholecalciferol is the technical term for that, right? So our body takes cholesterol, takes UV rays, and turns it into this cholecalciferol. Dietarily, what? We get it from foods that contain cholecalciferol, which is vitamin D3, or vitamin D2, which is found in mushrooms. And our body absorbs that with the help of bile and enzymes and these little compounds called micelles that help with the absorption and fats through the gut lining there. And then our blood levels of cholecalciferol get transported to the liver to be converted into what we know as part of the vitamin D pathway, which is that 25 hydroxyl vitamin D3. 25 hydroxyl vitamin D3 is then taken to other tissues, primarily the kidneys, where it's then converted into calcitriol. Now, calcitriol is true vitamin D, technically a hormone. So there's all these steps that we have to go through to get to the form that is actually used at a cellular level. And all of these steps, of course, require other cofactors and other nutrients, which we can totally go into as we talk about this. But every action you hear, oh, vitamin D does this. Oh, vitamin D does this. It's, oh, calcitriol does this. Oh, calcitriol does this action. And every cell in our body actually has receptors for vitamin D or calcitriol, right? And there are so many things that vitamin D does in our body. And its primary claim to fame and what it's gotten the most recognition for over the years is the regulation of calcium. But it's so much bigger than that. We see vitamin D playing into the regulation of neurotransmitters, right? It's responsible for some of the enzymatic conversions that go into making serotonin and dopamine and the regulation of those. We see that vitamin D is really important for the regulation of other enzymes, such as the side chain cleavage enzyme that goes into making all of our steroid hormones. A lot of steroid hormones needed in pregnancy, right? We find that it helps to regulate hepcidin levels, so helps regulate iron absorption in the body. It goes into regulating insulin production from the beta cells of the pancreas. There's so many, it goes into regulating white blood cell formation and function. So there are so many things that vitamin D does for our body, and it's probably one of the most important vitamins slash hormones for our physiology. We just don't really think of it as that.
Okay, that is wild. I have so many things that just came to my mind as you were talking. So I noted them and we'll come back to them because I want to stay on task here. But for vitamin D, would you say that most Americans, maybe specifically American women, are deficient in vitamin D when we start pregnancy?
Yes, it is considered one of the most common nutritional deficiencies, partially because of our lifestyle habits, right? A lot of us are sitting like you and I are right now inside. I'm one of those people, I sit inside pretty much all day for work. It stinks, but that's life, right? And we're not getting the UV rays if we're sitting inside. Humans traditionally were outside pretty much 24/7, able to get those UV rays, able to convert their cholesterol into pre-vitamin A and cholecalciferol. That's one aspect, right? We also, for sometimes good reasons, like to protect ourselves from those UV rays with sunscreen. We also find that people who live in certain parts of the world are more prone to vitamin D deficiency. So people who live on our globe above the 37th parallel have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency because of the change in the UV rays. We also find studies that show that people who live at higher altitudes, and there's almost like this bell curve because the higher you get to, then it flips flops the other way. So there's like this group of altitude in which if you live there, which, here where I live in Colorado, I fall right into this category. It's like a double-edged sword between the latitude and altitude. We have harder times converting our cholesterol into vitamin D because of the change in the UV rays. So those are those aspects. Then dietarily. Dietarily, we don't eat nearly as much vitamin D as maybe our ancestors did, right? Vitamin D is primarily an animal-based vitamin. If we go back to some of that breakdown I was talking about with the conversion and how we use those vitamin D compounds in the body, the 25-OHD3, a good chunk of that is actually stored in our adipose tissues for a rainy day, right? Some of it gets stored in the liver for a rainy day. And animals do the same thing. So if we're not eating enough animal fats, we might also be low in vitamin D. And I don't know if you remember the 80s, but there was a huge war on fat and particularly animal fats, right? Certain animals have more vitamin D than others in their fat content. Fish, right? Fish, that's their claim to fame, is their high content of vitamin A and vitamin D and some of these great fat soluble vitamins in their fat layers. Other animals nobody talks about is pigs. Pigs actually contain a lot of vitamin D in their fat layer. Pasture-raised pigs are one of our great sources of vitamin D. And if you look sometimes at the ancestral diets of people who live in the above the 37th parallel in some of these regions where vitamin D deficiency is more common, you will find that a lot of their diet was fish and wild pork. There was a reason our bodies actually maybe gravitated to some of those things. Not that people eat a lot of bear meat, but bear meat is also another one. Bear fat has a lot of vitamin D in it.
Wow, this is all so fascinating. Okay, I feel like we've done a good job of kind of pointing out what would happen if you didn't have enough, but is it possible to have too much vitamin D?
Yes, it is. And it is something we're seeing more and more in clinic because people do take a lot of vitamin D because keep hearing all the great benefits of it, right? And I'm going to promote all the benefits of it. But there's always a bell curve, right?
Sure.
In functional medicine, our goal is Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions on what that optimal range is if we're doing blood work for those 25-OH vitamin D, which that's actually what we're testing when we test the vitamin D, is that specific mid-grade factor. There's a lot of controversy over what that optimal level is. And I think it's just, we can go into it. But I think there's a lot of people who read the research but forget very minute details, which is what is the measurement that they're using when they measure that vitamin D, because that makes a big difference. And in my new book, I actually have a conversion chart for that, because I think that we're actually probably pushing people to slightly higher ends of vitamin D than we should. Now, again, think of it this way, right? Think of all the things that vitamin D does. It's going to regulate hormones. It's going to regulate insulin production. It's going to regulate neurotransmitters. It's going to regulate calcium. Now, hypercalcemia, so the development of too much calcium in the bloodstream, is our known measurement marker of vitamin D overdose. And we start to see that when blood levels get above 100 nanograms per milliliter. That tends to be where we start to see that, particularly in pregnancy. That being said, there are other things that I think we can see there. Sometimes it becomes changes in like iron absorption. Sometimes you can start to see things like iron overload in the body, and increase in the absorption of iron because of a dysregulation in this other hormone called hepcidin, which vitamin D plays into. So there is a series of things that we can see happening from more of an indirect perspective. But if you look at studies on the side effects of overdosing on vitamin D, everything will focus on high calcium levels.
Got it. Okay, and what would that manifest as on the outside? So we're talking a lot about like, what happens on the inside. Are we experiencing fatigue? Is our hair falling out? Are we just like really pale? What kind of things are we experiencing that might tip us off that says, I might should get my vitamin D levels checked?
Yeah, so when it comes to like low vitamin D, there's a whole range of things that we can see there. Everything from depression, not enough
Wow.
neurotransmitters, right? That's really a big one that we'll see is that fatigue, right? Fatigue and depression. Yeah, you can definitely see random things like hair falling out. There's a whole world of symptoms. You can, golly, I'm going to think through all of these. Hypertension is associated with that. We will see immune system changes. Maybe it's frequent colds because of those mechanisms of action as to how vitamin D works at those levels. On the flip side, sometimes high dose vitamin D is actually quite asymptomatic. We don't see a lot of symptoms until we've gone really far. And that only happens over the course of long-term supplementation. So overdosing on vitamin D, there's less research on what those side effects are, simply because the only way to really get there is to have either a genetic issue, right? Or to be overdosing on your supplements. And it is primarily that high calcium component. So you start to see calcification at different areas in the body. Maybe we go the other way and we start to get a hypertensive-esque component because now things are starting to get too calcified in the body. Vitamin D and vitamin A actually regulate back and forth. So vitamin D receptors and a vitamin A receptor called retinoid X receptor actually work together. And so if we start to take too much vitamin D, we start to see decreased vitamin A function. And flip-flop the other way, right? So these two, some people talk a lot about like zinc and copper and their ups and downs together. Vitamin A and vitamin D also have this regulation with one another.
Okay, and what about vitamin K? Because I feel like vitamin D3 and K are often sold as like peanut butter and jelly, salt and pepper, right sock, left sock, right? They come together. Is there any truth to that?
Sure. Yeah, all of the fat soluble vitamins work together. Vitamin K is its own beast. Same thing. We have different forms of vitamin K. There's different regulations with vitamin K. When people talk about the vitamin D and vitamin K combo, it's that K2 component, so a very specific form, and it helps with the regulation of how vitamin D works, primarily in its regulation of calcium with magnesium. They all kind of work together. And we do find that all of fat soluble vitamins, oftentimes dietarily, they're all found together as well in those different fatty sources. Or you look at traditional cooking methods and you find that fatty foods are oftentimes mixed with vitamin K green vegetables, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah, again, it's like we're drawn to what goes together. If we'll just tap into that intuition, intuitive eating is a thing because our bodies will tell us what it needs. Wow, that is
Absolutely.
fascinating. Okay, so in terms of supplementation, and just a reminder, you guys, Sarah is not your doctor. Is there a dose of, like maybe a maintenance dose of vitamin D that we see appropriate for most people? Or is this something that truly you need to be testing because you need something that is specialized for you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think that it is something we test, don't guess, because there is risk to overdoing it. And not everybody needs to do high dose. Now, the studies that we look at, there was a specific study done where they looked specifically in pregnancy and they watched what we needed between the supplementation of vitamin D, the cholecalciferol, the 25-OH vitamin D3, and calcitriol. Now, you also have to understand the physiology. Calcitriol production goes up in pregnancy. And if we're looking at blood levels, calcitriol increases, but 25-OHD3 comes down. So it's a utilization game. Now, we need a lot of this calcitriol for pregnancy physiology, right? It goes into progesterone production, it goes into regulating the placental production. The actual placenta itself actually contains the enzyme needed to convert 25-OH vitamin D into calcitriol, which is cool, just like a kidney. So what we find in some of these studies is that it takes 4,000 IU to basically maintain these levels and maximize the calcitriol levels.
Every day.
Every day. Yes. Which is why you start to see some of these supplement companies adding 4,000 IU of vitamin D. And what they're trying to do is maintain this 25-OH D3 level at a specific level. And what this study looked at was holding it at 40 nanograms per milliliter was what kept this calcitriol at an adequate level. And that was just that one study. But because of that study and what we saw, and they were looking at, again, all of those interactions of how the 25-OH and the calcitriol and the cholecalciferol, all these things look together on paper, and how do we optimize and maximize without going too far?
Without overdosing. That's the key.
Exactly. That being said, people's diets, where they live, their lifestyles, all of these things factor into their needs for vitamin D. So I think it's really important to get like a preconception baseline on vitamin D levels and then to test it at intervals throughout pregnancy so that we can adjust that supplementation. Some people coming in, they've got great vitamin D levels and it's not an issue for them. So a basic prenatal that has about 1,000 in there may be all they need. Other people might need a little bit of love just because they didn't have as much coming in, right? But it's also important to take into account not just that serum level, because there's all these other nutrients that play into vitamin D utilization, right? So iron is a big one. Nobody talks about iron when they talk about vitamin D levels. I've heard people talk about magnesium, right? Or like you said, vitamin K2. But I think iron is this kind of underrated support for vitamin D synthesis. The enzymes, the hydroxylase enzymes that help to take the cholecalciferol, turn it into that 25-OH vitamin D, and then turn it into calcitriol, each one of those enzymes has iron in the actual structural molecule. We're going into a little bit of biochemistry here. If you're iron deficient, we start to see a decrease in these iron-dependent enzymes in the body. And iron deficiency is associated with a reduction in the conversion of vitamin D into calcitriol, which is cool, right? And vitamin iron deficiency is something we do see in about 30% of pregnancies. So it's not uncommon. And this is just talking about iron deficiency, maybe even associated with anemia when you look at these studies, not even just iron deficiency without anemia. So there's that aspect. Then, if we've made those enzymes, magnesium works as the cofactor for those enzymes. So we have to have magnesium for that to happen. The other one we need is zinc. Zinc is really important for the transport protein. So you could have all the cholecalciferol, you could be taking a 25-OH vitamin D supplement, all these things, but if you cannot make the transport protein, you can't get it anywhere. There's no place for it to bind, right? And then lastly, progesterone. There's this wonderful, maybe not so wonderful if you have issues, cyclical relationship between progesterone and vitamin D. You have to have progesterone to make vitamin D receptors. And then, of course, you need vitamin D to regulate that side chain cleavage enzyme that goes into down the line of steroidogenesis, stroke. And there are studies that talk about this interesting little relationship between low vitamin D and low progesterone. So it's a little bit more complicated sometimes than just, oh, my vitamin D levels were low and I need to take a vitamin D supplement. Right? Sometimes if those vitamin D levels are getting too high and somebody hasn't been supplementing, sometimes we start to think, are we having a conversion issue? Right? Do we have kidney damage? Kidney damage would cause that. Do we have low progesterone, maybe in a pregnancy, that's causing a poor conversion or a poor breakdown of the pathways that go into vitamin D metabolism? And then the other ones we don't think about very much is this other little trace mineral called boron. Boron is a mineral nobody talks about. But boron does play a little bit into the vitamin D regulation. With calcitriol, once we've made calcitriol, as our calcitriol levels go up, it stimulates like a negative feedback mechanism. It's the same thing that you see with like thyroid hormones, right? As thyroid hormones go up, TSH comes down, right? So as calcitriol comes, we start to see that it reduces the production of our hydroxylase enzymes. So we start to see a reduction in that conversion of cholecalciferol to 25-OH vitamin D, and then you start to see a reduction in the conversion of 25-OH vitamin D into calcitriol, so that we can come up, we can come down, and then, oh, look, we came down, so we're going to make that conversion happen more so we can regulate these. So we're doing this game in the bloodstream sometimes as we regulate that. One of the things that we see with boron is that it actually works to inhibit a specific enzyme that inactivates calcitriol. And so we find in studies that if we give boron, or if somebody is low in boron, it changes these different levels of vitamin D, whether it's the 25-OH vitamin D or the calcitriol. So it's almost part of this negative feedback mechanism to some degree to regulate it.
So is that the resolution for someone who has poor conversion, or are there different resolutions depending on why someone has poor conversion?
It's always based on the why, right? This is why we don't do blanket treatments, is because you have to understand the individual's kind of biochemical individual identity. What's going on in that specific person to cause that dysfunction?
Sure. Okay. And then what kind of test are we asking from our providers? If it's different prenatally versus pregnancy, let us know, because I know there's going to be a ton of listeners out there who are like, I would like to get this checked before I'm pregnant. But then
Sure.
obviously we've got thousands of people who are like, I'm already pregnant. So
Yeah,
help us understand what you recommend for that, or what someone could consider for that.
sure. So currently, the 25-OH vitamin D3 test is considered the most accurate measure of vitamin D status, right? You can get tests that do measure the calcitriol in conjunction with the 25-OH, but there's not enough research to say which way is more accurate. I know a lot of providers are starting to do both. It's expensive to do both. So that oftentimes is a hindrance for a lot of people, and a lot of a lot of physicians and practitioners too. It's hard to tell a patient, yeah, I can run this test for you, but it's gonna be several $100s when you can get a vitamin D 25OH vitamin D test for $40, $50. So that is still considered the gold standard of assessing vitamin D levels. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that conversion, like the unit of measurement on these blood tests. Here in the US, when you get a vitamin D, 25OH vitamin D test, what you're going to see is a measurement called a nanogram per milliliter. When you look at most research studies, they're using what's called a nanomole per liter. These are two very different measurements. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, is because you will see studies. There's like a study that was done that talked about, it was a 2023 study that talked about vitamin D levels in association with preeclampsia, right? And they used 75 nanomoles per liter. That was that was one of their cutoffs. And they found that if somebody was lower than 75 nanomoles per liter, they had higher risk of preeclampsia. Over that, we were actually looking pretty good. So I think people read a lot of these studies and, oh, 50, 75, I have to have my blood levels at 50 and 75 to have that protection. But it's a different unit of measurement. 75 nanomoles per liter is equal to 30 nanograms per milliliter. And then if you look at the studies that say, oh, look, what's our protective level for nanograms per milliliter? It's 30, which is what is the low end of the reference range on most standard like LabCorp and Quest. So I think there's this element of confusion on what that optimal range is because people read the study, but they don't take into account that unit of measure. Does that make sense?
That makes total
And
sense.
that's where, yeah, where you see other studies that talk about those higher levels on the nanogram per milliliters starting to show that the hypercalcification, right? Some studies will say 80 nanograms per milliliter is that cut up for the upper range in which we start to see increased calcification. Definitely over 100 in pregnancy, we start to see that in research.
So in pregnancy, that can be really problematic because it must have some sort of influence on calcification of the placenta.
You'd like to think so. Currently, I haven't seen any definitive study linking that, but I think theoretically, if we were taking too much, it's a potential.
Yeah. So if you lived in a super sunny place and you spent most of your days outside and you ate a very leafy, green, friendly, vitamin D high diet, we should definitely, not that everyone shouldn't be looking at their prenatals, but if you live in one of those places, definitely consider what's in your prenatal and maybe tailor that to yourself, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I see patients in all areas, and
Yeah.
I always joke it's my Florida patients are the ones I'm less worried about, right? They're doing pretty good with their vitamin D levels for the most part, right? There's definitely some that sneak through there because they use a lot of sunscreen as well, right?
Oh,
They're staying out of that UV ray. But in general, they're doing pretty good. Here in my home state of Colorado, vitamin D deficiency is probably one of the most common things that I see in testing. And
wow.
it's just like I said, we've got this double-edged sword of where we live, right? With being above that 37th parallel and then being in that little gap of altitude where we just see a decrease in the correct UV rays needed to make vitamin D. And we're inside a lot, especially in the winter.
Yeah, especially in the winter. Yeah, even when it is sunny in the winter, it's like such a headache to get outside because it's so cold. You may be in the sun, but it is just so cold. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about the impacts of vitamin D on placental health and hypertension. And blood sugar regulation. Can you talk to us about the direct connection between vitamin D and preeclampsia and gestational diabetes? So two things that a lot of pregnant people face and or it's on your mind. Talk
Yeah,
to us about what we need to know about vitamin D and those two complications.
sure. So when we look at the research on vitamin D and preeclampsia, timing is everything, right? You're not going to take a vitamin D supplement when you've already got preeclampsia symptoms and expect it to do anything. And again, we see the research that shows this. This is why certain groups, like that most recent Cochrane review of vitamin D preeclampsia stuff, came out in 2024, and it said there's just not enough evidence to show that it works. And its timing is really important. Preconception through the first 20 weeks is probably the most important phase for that vitamin D level to be adequate. So for looking at preeclampsia in general, it's considered a disease of endothelial cells, right? It's an endothelial cell dysfunction, whether that's due to lipid peroxidation, hypoxia, oxidative stress, changes in the spiral arteries development and those different phases of placental development. Whatever it is, these things happen in like the first 16, 20 weeks of pregnancy. And how somebody's vitamin D status comes into pregnancy is going to be really important for that first phase of placental development, which is those first 8 weeks. Half of that, you don't even know you're pregnant, right? So this is the most important part. It goes into regulating aldosterone, that goes into regulating our different electrolytes and blood pressure, and then it goes into opening the blood vessels and regulating the neurotransmitters that go into that aspect of things. We see that it goes into the immune system changes, right? I mentioned that a second ago. Different immune system changes are normal in pregnancy. We expect to see a 55% increase in white blood cells, most of that being associated with the neutrophil increase. We expect to see a decrease in lymphocyte production. And vitamin D does facilitate some of this change. It's a really important part. We also see changes in macrophages. Dysfunction in a lot of these white blood cells is highly associated with increased rates of preeclampsia. And we find that vitamin D helps to regulate some of this white blood cell shift that happens in those first weeks of pregnancy. So there's this huge immune system part when it comes to that. We also find that regulation from the calcium perspective, right? That's going to go into those blood vessels themselves. Interestingly, the only nutrient currently with enough evidence to show that it can be preventive for preeclampsia is calcium. And so we go, there's that vitamin D calcium game too, where we go vitamin D helps with calcium. You have to have calcitriol for calcium, or calcitriol for calcium absorption, hence the name. It's in the name, calcitriol, right? Vitamin D was known as the hormone that regulates calcium. That was like its only job, according to what we knew for decades. Now we know it does so much more, but it was such an important piece that they named the hormone calcitriol. Right? It plays into that. So when we look at these studies, it's this huge game, right? Of this begets this, begets this, and it's all interconnected. But that first trimester part is really important. Some studies will even show that vitamin D deficiency is associated with changes in the way the placenta actually infiltrates and implants into the endometrial lining.
Wow.
So there's all these things that can happen from that preeclampsia side. Progesterone, going back into there's the connection between low progesterone in the first trimester and preeclampsia later. On the gestational diabetes front, it can be partially that immune system response where we're a little bit more inflamed than we should be. Gestational diabetes is, and so is preeclampsia. They're very complicated. And the connection with vitamin D is just one of many. Like I said, there's so many pieces. It's never just one piece that's causing it. But vitamin D is important for how the beta cells actually produce insulin. So if we're vitamin D deficient, we actually see a change in insulin production, right? Then we get high blood sugars. We're not grabbing it, we're not binding it, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing with it. From an inflammation perspective, inflammation and elevated cortisol levels is associated with those higher fasting glucose levels. So the inflammation side behind vitamin D may also play into that gestational diabetes game.
Wow, it is such an intricate, just the human body knows so much. And it reminds me of the experiments that we did in high school that if you change one little thing on one part, the entire circuit has the potential to get messed up. And you're trying to just adjust just enough without overdoing it. It feels exactly like this.
It is. It's totally like that. And I always joke it's amazing that any of us are even here, right? Because it has to be, there's so much room for error, I feel. But our bodies are amazing and it knows what to do. It's just, I think that we oftentimes, again, a Goldilocks thing, we can underdo it and we can overdo it. And it's just learning what our individual bodies need and then respecting what our bodies are capable of, right? And understanding that physiology.
Yeah. So, is it possible that if you are having high blood sugar in pregnancy, that maybe adjusting some of your vitamin D levels might help balance that out? Or is that a bit too far-fetched?
Theoretically, yes,
But what else is going
but
on?
exactly. There's, again, it's never one thing.
Sure.
This is just one little piece, right? And we find that if we're looking at blood sugar levels, that's again a whole complicated game. Is it just the fasting glucose levels that are doing it? Is it the postprandials that are doing it? Right? It's so much more. It's such a complicated.
Game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we keep talking about vitamin D being a hormone and it works with our hormone regulation. Talk to our PCOS girlies out there. What does PCOS and vitamin D, how are those overlapping and working together or against each other?
It's all those things we talked about, right? Vitamin D deficiency is, again, one of the most common nutritional deficiencies probably found in people who suffer from PCOS. PCOS is, I'm going to say it again, it's a very complicated condition because it's not just one cause.
Sure.
The most common cause associated with PCOS is insulin resistance, right? But PCOS is just polycystic ovarian syndrome. It means you have a whole bunch of cysts on your ovaries. You can have all of these other metabolic things, but never get the cysts on your ovaries. So it's very complicated. And I always challenge people who have been diagnosed with PCOS to say, were you diagnosed with cysts on your ovaries? Okay, that puts you in this category. Were you diagnosed with other things that are hormonally related to PCOS, but you don't have a pearl of cysts on your ovaries? Okay, that puts you into this category. If we go back to people who have cysts on their ovaries, this tends to be a metabolic issue, right? Or a stress issue. So this is just, it's like a checklist. Okay, here are all the conditions that make you form cysts on your ovaries, right? Some of them are excess conditions, some of them are deficiency conditions, but you will find that insulin resistance causes cysts on the ovaries because they're basically malnourished eggs that never got fully developed. Sugar grows babies. And I say this all the time, glucose is the primary fuel source of egg development, right? And that's even in those weeks leading up to ovulation, it is glucose that gets into those cells and feeds this rapid cellular growth, right? You have to have thyroid hormones to use that glucose. That's part of that revving of the metabolism a little bit, right? So you do find higher rates of cystic ovaries in people with hypothyroidism. And then you find cystic ovaries in people with insulin resistance, right? The insulin isn't getting into the cell. It's actually a malnourished glucose cell. There's not enough glucose in the cell. It's not a true disease of high glucose at a cellular level. It's backing up in the system and it's causing high blood sugars and it might be causing high triglycerides and everything with that. But the egg itself is actually low glucose. It's low metabolic. There's other things that cause that too, right? Anything that changes the ability of that cell to use calories and turn it into energy for growth will cause multiple cysts on the ovaries, especially if it's a chronic condition. You find that stress causes PCOS, right? There's a specific condition called functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. This is a condition in which the cells are starved, or the body itself is under so much stress, it says survival is more important than reproduction. So it decreases anything associated with the development of those follicles into eggs, thus creating those same cysts. PCOS is the most common gynecological condition diagnosed in athletes, athletic women.
Because their bodies are under so much stress in
And a
their
lot of
mind.
them, exactly, and a lot of athletic women are following very restrictive diets that are high protein, low fat, low carb, high protein, some vegetables, but they're doing more of a low fat, low carb diet on top of that, high protein, right? And that ends up creating that same response as you would see with somebody who was almost in an like anorexic, right?
Mhm.
Teenage athletes, right? How many teenage athletic friends did you have who skipped periods? That's functional hypothalamic anovulation. The body was so stressed that it said, I can't do it all. I have to exercise. I've got to go do these things. Reproduction is last, right? So we have different types of PCOS. If we go to the other side, which is that metabolic side, right? Yes, that could in fact cause that little bit of PCOS. And yes, for a lot of these things, vitamin D becomes a piece of that. If you have somebody who is falling into that specific dietary pattern where they are low fat, they're going to be vitamin D deficient, right? Remember, vitamin D is the foundation of the making of all of our steroid hormones. That's progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, cortisol, which is our stress hormone. So vitamin D deficiency will change the production of all of that from that little follicle, right? Our hormones as women come from the development of that follicle. So if we have any change there, that will end up causing that. And the ovary itself stores and takes in vitamin D and stores it into these areas. Vitamin D has been associated with our anti-malarial hormone, which anti-malarial hormone is the hormone that we use to tell us how many eggs we have left behind. And we find studies that show that vitamin D deficiency is associated with lower AMH. So many connections with that PCOS side,
Any
right?
connections,
So many things. Elevated AMH is super common in people with cysts on their ovaries because those cysts make AMH.
but not necessarily more eggs because it's due to cysts. Is that correct?
Technically, the cysts are the eggs, right? They just never got released.
Wow.
They're still on that ovary, still making that AMH.
Just
As
hanging,
they
causing
resolve, that, yeah, just causing trouble.
Wow, I'm having so many mind blown moments. I feel like I'm having a hard time creating questions because I'm just seeing so many. I'm having like a that's a Raven moment where all the pieces, I can see them playing out in front of my face. That is just all so wild. I do have a question about red light therapy and low vitamin D levels because if you live in a place where it maybe is hard to get out, especially for a season or two, you live in a really rainy place, you live in a really cold place, you live in a really dreary place. Is there any data around red light therapy? It's all the rage. I love mine, whether it's wackadoo science or not. I love my red light therapy. So, what's the data say in terms of helping maybe supplement some of our vitamin D levels?
So there are some studies on it. Some of them are actually quite old, actually. There's some from the early 2000s that showed that 8 weeks of exposure to a UV or sun lamp increased the circulation of that 25 OH vitamin D. And I think it was about 25%.
Wow, so pretty significant.
So pretty significant. It could be a useful tool for somebody who does live in an area in which their UV exposure isn't that great, or somebody who, like me, unfortunately has to sit in an office for so many hours a day.
Counterbalance some of those, the white lights, the office lights.
Exactly.
Fluorescent
I do
lighting.
I do have a window, so
That is nice. Yeah, that's very nice. Look, I'm a beach gal. I am a summer girl all the way. I love being outside. When it is summer and the temps are nice, I am outside from literally dusk till dawn, from the time that my eyes open till basically it's time to come in and eat dinner. I am outside, but I do find myself struggling during the winters in Boston. It's just so cold and there's so much snow. And like I mentioned earlier, that even when it's sunny out, I still know it's only 7 degrees outside. So it's just so
yeah.
for me to get out. I think that red light for a lot of people feels a lot more doable, even though I think we all recognize like it's not the sun.
It's not the same. There's so many other benefits, of course, to
Sure.
being outside from that emotional perspective, right?
Mhm.
Versus just the vitamin D. But in a pinch, it could help,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I've seen some studies that talk about the ebbs and flows of vitamin D and how our body may actually like big ups and downs
Oh,
versus a steady level. And this is, of course, coming from looking at evolution and like the anthropological look at how humans lived, right? And our exposure and how we may have had sun exposure all summer, right? Gotten high levels of it, built it up, stored it in our adipose tissues, stored it in our livers, and then over the course of winter, used it, right? And so it would be this huge up in the summer, and then we'd use up because the winters changed, obviously, our UV exposure, like we're talking about, and it came down. And of course, we consumed, hopefully, the diet through the winter, which if you look at a lot of winter recipes, they're very vitamin D heavy. Right? A lot of mushrooms, a lot of pork, a lot of fish. Like you can definitely do a very winter-based diet that's high vitamin D in the diet. And how we may have actually been better and we need these ups and downs on a seasonal basis with those vitamin D levels versus a steady.
yeah. It's almost like you charge a battery up and then you use it. And by the time summer comes around, your battery of vitamin D is almost dead. And you spend the winter charging it up or you spend the summer charging it up because another winter is on the way. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh, so many just mind-blowing moments. Okay, I'm ready to wrap up, and I would be remiss if I had you on to talk about vitamin D, and we didn't discuss vitamin D in breastfeeding and whether supplementation in newborns was appropriate, was evidence-based, was something that people should heavily consider or just consider based on personal factors, where you live, mom's diet, whether you're
Right.
breastfeeding or formula feeding, whatever that is.
hmm Oh gosh, this is a fun one, right? Because the breastfeeding nutrient game is so controversial. And I think that there is actually a very good reason why breast milk is low in a lot of these nutrients sometimes. If we look at, and again, babies should have accumulated a lot of these things in that third trimester leading up to delivery, right? Iron is a fantastic, I know it's not vitamin D, but iron is just a good example of this, right? Breast milk doesn't have iron in it, right? It's very low in iron. And we find that babies should have accumulated 300 to 400 milligrams of iron through the third trimester as stored ferritin, which pretty much gets them through those first couple of months of life when iron absorption is down. Their stomachs are immature. Iron is really hard on the stomach, right? If you're somebody who has taken an iron supplement and you didn't absorb it, oh, you know it. It hurts. It causes a lot of gastric upset. And if you take iron and you throw it into an immature digestive system that doesn't have bacteria, that is struggling with stomach acid production and just hasn't regulated itself, it's really toxic. It's really hard on that system. They're not ready for that. What they need is really simple compounds, amino acids, glucose, a little bit of fat, right? They just need some basics until that microbiome gets established and their gut has matured and is capable of breaking that down a little bit more. So there's a reason. And third trimester should have prepared that infant for that time frame in which their breast milk was lower in these things, right? Vitamin D stores in the body. Vitamin K, right? Talk about vitamin K. It's not vitamin K that actually gets transferred to baby. And there's a reason, again, vitamin K is low in breast milk. Blood clotting factors get transferred to our babies, which mom makes from vitamin K. So mom's third trimester vitamin K status sets baby up for success with blood clotting factors, not vitamin K. We find that vitamin K doesn't really transfer to baby through the placenta, but blood clotting factors do, right? The same thing goes for vitamin D to some degree. If baby is vitamin D deficient, it's because mom is vitamin D deficient. That's why. Now, going back to the research, what we find is that with breast milk for babies to get the small amount, was it 400 IU that they need through breast milk? Mom needs to consume about 6,400 IU
Wow.
of vitamin D per day.
So more than that 4,000 that you might commonly find.
Exactly. Some of that is going to come from her storage of vitamin D, right? Because we store vitamin D. It's a fat soluble vitamin. We store it in, again, fat tissues, liver, all of that. And she's going to break that down. Part of it's going to come from her sun exposure, and part of it's going to come from her diet. But according to the research on, that's what we need. Now, there are studies that link maternal vitamin D deficiency with microbiome changes in baby. And we're talking about that third trimester stuff. So if mom is low vitamin D in the third trimester, we see that the fetal microbiome is flip-flopped. We see less of our good probiotics and we see more of our opportunistic bacteria. We also find that if mom had a vitamin D deficiency in pregnancy, her kiddo is more likely to have eczema. So there's these really interesting things. And we always talk, if you want to prevent anything in that postpartum phase, you have to work backwards, right? I have a saying, and I say it all the time, but everything in pregnancy is just preparing for preparing. You're never on top of anything. Just when you think you're on top of it, you're not, right? And you have to work backwards to fix things. So if we have a complication that arises in the third trimester, something happened in the second trimester, or maybe even the first trimester, right? And that's where we should have been working. So if we look at that postpartum, if there's hiccups that happen postpartum, it's because we missed something in that third trimester. So if we want to prevent, we have to work before. So if we want to prevent anything that's associated with first trimester stuff, maybe that's the development of that placenta. Maybe that's hyperemesis. Maybe that's reducing the risk of miscarriage. You need to be working in that trimester before. So those months leading up to conception. You're not going to take a prenatal as soon as you find out you're pregnant and fix any nutritional issues there.
Yeah, it's almost once you're pregnant. It's not too late, but you are definitely behind the 8 ball.
Exactly. It just makes it harder, right? When it comes to that first trimester game, there's things that we can affect, right? And there's things we can't do much for because of just the physiology, right? We can help that placenta a little bit because we can go through mom and come from her area to help with some of that arterial spiraling, help with hormone production, those sorts of things. But our embryo has everything it needs to grow that it brought with it from mom and dad preconception until about 8-10 weeks when we unplug those spiral arteries and get fresh blood to baby and pull out all the toxic waste products that happened through cellular respiration and all of that cellular turnover. So there's this element of control we can and let go of we can't. And prevention is easier than treatment.
Always. It always will be every single time. Oh my gosh. Prevent yourself from getting sick so that you don't actually have to go through all of that sick care. Okay, my very last question for you, and I promise this is my last question because I want to be respectful of your time. But postpartum mood complications, obviously emotions are all over the place, postpartum depression, anxiety. I know previously in the episode you mentioned vitamin D has an association, has a relationship with dopamine regulation. I'd love to hear vitamin D levels in association to postpartum mood complications, plus how scrolling on our phone can absolutely destroy this. Not only for your mental health of comparisonitis or always feeling like you're a bad mom or always feeling like people have it more put together than you, which is not true, you guys. None of us know what we're doing at all. But what does vitamin D have to do with those type of things? And what should we know as women going into postpartum on how we can maybe protect ourselves from some of that a little bit?
Yes. So with vitamin D, it's really important for some of our serotonin conversions, serotonin, melatonin conversions, and then the dopamine, norepinephrine, adrenaline conversions there. Preconception or the third trimester, right? This is going to be the best place for people to hug that vitamin D level leading into this. There is childbirth is stressful, right? I have 2 kids, natural births each time. Right? It's physically stressful, it's emotionally stressful, it's all the things. you find that there is a surge in our catecholamines, right? Our neurotransmitters increase exponentially. Melatonin increases. The norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is adrenaline, they increase exponentially, right? Cortisol increases by 500%. It's huge. And vitamin D is responsible for all of this neurotransmitter production. Studies link low vitamin D with actually increased pain perception in labor, so higher rates of epidural use and those sorts of things, which I think is fascinating because we're not regulating those neurotransmitters correctly. We should have a balance of neurotransmitters that, yes, we have this huge surge, but you should have a mechanism to help you get through it. There's all these great neurotransmitters where it's melatonin, DMT. Nobody talks about DMT on labor, but that's fascinating. And these are regulated to some degree by that vitamin D level. Now, postpartum, these all tank, right? And we almost go through a normal, and I hate to say normal, because it feels horrible, but there's almost like this normal depressive state that happens postpartum, which is basically a recovery phase. You can't live high adrenaline, you can't live high neurotransmitter, and then just go back to normal, right? You have to recover from that. And recovering from that is rest and digest, a lot of sleep, right? And that's shutting the system down. You're tired, you're not motivated, all those things, right? On the extreme side, which could be associated, we had a deficiency coming in, we used it like crazy to make all of these neurotransmitters, and now we're tanking, but we're tanking past to the point of normal.
So true depletion.
The true depletion. And now we have no regulation and we're just tanked across the board to the point of illness, right? So that's a potential in those cases. If we are scrolling, right? So bringing up the scrolling side, oh God, that is a dopamine hit like nobody's business, right? And it doesn't even have to be anything big, but literally just the action of movement focus, movement refocus. You're asking your body to hyperproduce the dopamine. And if we do that, we start to exhaust that already exhausted system. And as much as I wish we could just continually make neurotransmitters, we can't, right? We have to recover these things. And typically it's when we sleep. And depression is our way of shutting it down into a I'm not asleep, but I'm asleep scenario, or to ration, maybe that's a better way to say it, our neurotransmitters, and only focus on what we have to do in body, right? Being happy is not a necessity for life, right? Being motivated to go do things is not necessarily a necessity. Reducing inflammation is, getting your heart rate going is, right? There's a lot of other things that are more subconscious things that our body does that's way more important for survival. And so we go just into those things. So that's one aspect. But there's other things that play into the depression and anxiety side. Iron deficiency is another one. B vitamin deficiencies. Vitamin D is just one nutrient associated with those neurotransmitter regulation pathways. You have different B vitamins, iron, vitamin C even will play into some of the regulation and the production of those neurotransmitters. So there's a lot more that plays into that. Thyroid is another one. Nobody talks about hypothyroidism in a postpartum depressive phase, but it's actually probably more common than some of these other things that we tend to focus on. And having a subclinical hypothyroidism pattern in the third trimester makes it more likely that somebody is going to have a postpartum depressive phase. So again, if somebody has a history of postpartum depression, they're looking to prevent postpartum depression, they need to start looking at their overall health, nutrient status, all of those things with 28 weeks, maybe even 20 weeks, right? Looking at that time frame so that they have time to build any sort of deficiency that might be there. So when we get into that postpartum phase, they're a little bit more robust and they're a little bit less deplete. So we just go through a normal recovery phase versus an extreme depletion.
Which, of course, society and our national policies and lack of support for family, women, children in general just works against us in all of that. You guys, if you're out there struggling, you're like, this just doesn't feel possible. It's hard and it's not your fault. You can do all the things, you can do a lot of the things, and sometimes the cards are just stacked against you. And I just want to take a moment to recognize I see you if you're out there doing everything and you still feel like it's just too much. It is a lot for sure. Dr. Sarah, this has been amazing. This was everything I dreamed of for this interview and more. And I'm just so thankful that you joined us today and shared some of this. And you talk a lot about this in your book. So tell us about the books you already have available and your new book that's come in, and how people can connect with you if they were interested in learning more or working with you.
Yep. So I have two books. My first book was published in 2021 and it's called Functional Maternity. And the idea there was just to introduce functional medicine and nutrition and how it could help improve pregnancy and childbirth outcomes. So I have it broken down chapter by chapter in different topics such as anemia, hypothyroidism, hypertension, and different things that shows the impact of the physiology and how we can hug the physiology with nutrition. My second book came out in January, which is more of a textbook. It's a practitioner's guide to functional lab analysis. And it took me years to put together, but is definitely more for a practitioner than it is the lay person or the mom out there who is pregnant and wanting to read her own labs. I never quite recommend that. If people are interested in learning more about how functional medicine plays into maternity care, they can find me on Instagram. That's probably the best place to get me. I post studies, I post tips and tricks and facts on the physiology on there, but it is at functional.maternity.
You guys, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a great episode. Don't forget to connect with Dr. Sarah on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, you can head to your app store and download the Birth Lounge app for evidence-based childbirth education and data-driven postpartum support delivered straight to your phone. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I truly do value this community and I love hanging out with you. You deserve to have a birth that you love with a provider that values your autonomy and respects informed consent. It's an honor to be your go-to gal when it comes to preparing for your baby. If you found today's episode helpful, share it with a friend. Share it with someone who could use evidence-based information to help them have an informed and confident birth. I'd love to hear what you have to say and read your sweet words. By leaving us a review, you are helping other expectant mamas and their families find the podcast so that we can reduce birth trauma and improve maternity care in the U.S. one birth at a time. If you're interested in joining the Birth Lounge, go to thebirthlounge.com. If you want to connect with me on socials, you can find me at Tranquility by Hehe on all platforms. Until next time, stay educated, stay supported, stay confident. Bye.